Alright, utilitarianism. We were just taking a look at Kant's moral theory, and we found it to be deontological from the Greek meaning dios, meaning deed. Right? So for Kant, the moral value of the action comes from the intentions behind the action, and the moral quality of the action itself, and not the outcomes. What we're moving to now with our study of utilitarianism as introduced by John Stuart Mill in this book is, well, the opposite view, right? That it is the outcomes of the actions that determine the moral quality of the actions, and not necessarily the intentions or the moral quality of the action itself. It's the outcome that informs us as to what the moral quality of the action is, right? And as we'll see with Mill, the intentions actually affect the utility of the action itself. So, just in general, what do we mean by utility? Right? Well, we can think of Batman's utility belt. What was it good for? All sorts of things, right? It had all sorts of gizmos so that he could solve all sorts of problems. It was handy for lots of things. A sport utility vehicle. What do we mean by that? Right? One that is going to be handy for all sorts of terrain. Right? A big, powerful vehicle that can get you through rough situations. Right? So utility is going to be connected to usefulness. Right? So the action that's going to be morally good for a utilitarian is the one that's going to be the handiest, the one that's going to result in the best sorts of outcomes. Now, in terms of what Jeremy Bentham, Mill's teacher, and Mill eventually are doing, is they are introducing a rather simple definition of happiness as the basis for their moral theory. Right? Happiness is pleasure and absence from pain. Right? Simple definition. Unlike Aristotle, who was claiming happiness as an activity of the soul in accord with virtue, they're just simply defining it as pleasure in the absence of pain. So that's what utility aims at. So we can rate the utility of an action in terms of its fitness or ability to produce pleasure and avoid pain, that is, to bring about happiness by this definition. So when I introduce utilitarianism, what I usually do is introduce you to Jeremy Bentham, who was Mill's teacher, and then contrast Mill with Bentham. Right? So we'll do that. And Jeremy Bentham was an interesting person. He came up with what's sometimes called the calculus of felicity, what's sometimes called hedonistic calculus, and what I'm going to introduce to you today as sort of a complicated pros and cons chart, right, in order to rate the utilitarian value of our actions, of our potential actions. So, when you're comparing one action to another to determine exactly what you should do in a particular situation, Bentham suggests that you look at the action in terms of 7 particular categories. The first is intensity. How intense is the pleasure? The second would be duration. How long does the pleasure last? The third would be certainty. How sure are you that the pleasure will occur? Fourth would be proximity. How soon do we get to experience the pleasure? Number 5 is fecundity. This is the weird one. How many more pleasures will happen because of this one pleasure, or because of this pleasure? 6, purity. How free from pain is the pleasure? And finally, 7, extent. How many of us will experience the pleasure? So, as we can already see from these 7 categories, what Bentham was trying to establish is a formula for determining which action would be most likely to produce what he calls the greatest good for the greatest number. And both he and Mill agree about this. Both Bentham and Mill agree that a pleasure principle guiding in ethics need not be selfish, and we see this in category 7 with Bentham. Extent. How many of us get to experience the pleasure? Now, how we would use this chart is that when we're trying to determine what action we should do, should I go for a beer or should I read this philosophy book? Right? What we should do is give each of these potential choices a rating out of 10 on this scale in terms of these 7 categories. Right? So, I'll just go through a few of them and move on quickly. Right? So, with the first, intensity, what you would do is just create a chart and put beer on one side, read philosophy book on the other, and in terms of each of the categories, give it a rating out of 10. So how intense is the pleasure of having a beer? Let's say it's about an 8, right? Whereas I myself would find reading a philosophy book very intensely pleasurable, right? So that might get a 10, right? Duration, how long does the pleasure last? The beer would rate rather low, right? Whereas reading the philosophy book, reading John Stuart Mill, will last you the rest of your life and hopefully aid you in your moral considerations, or at least be an interesting read that you may think back on every now and again. So, in terms of duration, a philosophy book would rate higher. Certainty, how sure are you that the pleasure will occur? Well, when reading these guys, I'm not even sure I'm going to enjoy it. So the philosophy book would rate rather low, whereas, you know, if you like beer, you like beer, right? So if you like beer, you would give beer a high rating. You'd be quite certain that pleasure will occur, and so on and so forth. Once you're done rating your pleasure in terms of these categories and evaluating them in terms of their utilitarian value with regard to each category, what you do is you add up the responses, right? And the one with the higher numerical value is the action that ought to get done. Right? So this is a complicated way of rating what sorts of pleasure and what sorts of pain, the pleasure you gain and pain you avoid, and determine exactly which of these actions ought be done. Right? Now, this is an interesting system, and Bentham actually applied this to the case of whether or not he should get married. Right? If you're curious, he got married. Right? But nonetheless, right? So, in terms of just how we use this, what's actually going on here, well, this is a complicated system for the application of this pleasure principle, and I will say that I hope people in hospital administration wards are calculating the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? People in crime fighting, I hope they are calculating the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? This is actually a moral system that goes into effect. I hope politicians are doing this as well. The greatest good for the greatest number. Right? So this is a rather potent moral system that has a number of branches that come out of it. There are a number of different kinds of utilitarianism, but we'll be studying it generally. And you just met Jeremy Bentham.